adjourn. I'd like to call the notice, call the notice and agenda for an emergency village board meeting. We call that to order. We had the Pledge of Allegiance. May I get a roll call, please?
Trustee Walter?
Here.
Trustee Conan?
Here.
Trustee Lendy?
Here.
Trustee Cook?
Here.
Trustee Heron?
Here.
Trustee Montalto?
Here.
President Michael?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay. Public comments. We're calling this emergency village board meeting in order to pass a local state of emergency. Resolution has been presented, and we're asking that be approved to extend powers to the village president during the state of emergency and a declaration of an emergency and executive order. Any public comments? No. Hearing none? Okay. Under new business, could I get a motion to approve the resolution approving extending the powers of the village president during the state of emergency? So moved.
I'll make a motion.
Second by, first by Trustee Montalto, second by Trustee Heron. Discussion. Are there any questions?
Sean, would it be appropriate to have Laura explain the impetus for this?
Yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's two items up tonight. One is the declaration of the state of emergency and the executive order, and the other is the resolution. To be clear, the item is the proclamation or declaration of the state of emergency and executive order is something that is already authorized and within the purview of the village president under the current village code. And that has been in effect since at least 1993, and that mirrors state statute under the Emergency Act and under the municipal code provisions. What the purpose of the resolution is to extend the time frame in which the declaration and emergency executive order can last, because under both of the statutory provisions and the village code, it's either limited to the next regular meeting of the village board or 7 days. So that would require, the village president could go ahead and make the proclamation without any approval, but it would have to be renewed repeatedly. And the thought of the resolution was to avoid having to have the board keep reconvening to continue the state of emergency, that it could continue along with the federally declared state and the state declared state, or until such time the local conditions change, in which it would end earlier. The powers and the language with regard to what the village president can or cannot do, most of that is already granted in the current ordinance, where section 1-6-8C4A does allow the village president currently in a state of emergency to exercise legislative powers or whatever else he deems necessary for the purposes of meeting the emergency. This does not mean that the president can approve anything. It doesn't mean he can approve development issues or any other extraordinary thing that would ordinarily require board action. What it does mean is that he could act, in such a manner as to respond to the current coronavirus situation, or he can act if there's something that would require board approval but is necessary to keep the operations of the village going, such as approving an expenditure that would ordinarily be on the board meeting, but if a board meeting canceled, it would allow him to go ahead and approve that type of action, but it wouldn't be any extraordinary type thing that would otherwise require board approval. As I said in my correspondence earlier, there's no obligation that the board pass this resolution, and if the comfort level is for the renewal to keep coming before the board, that's certainly, an option. Another option would be the board could pass the resolution, and if at such time it goes beyond the statutory time frame or the 7 days or the next board meeting, and the board determines it's not appropriate, the board could rescind the resolution and then thereby stop the ongoing powers. It just can't stop those powers without amending the ordinance beyond what is already allowed.
Thank you, Laura. Any questions for Laura?
I know that's a lot there.
Any questions for Laura?
This is
No.
Jen. I'm sorry. My question would be on the, I think it came off as a draft, but the declaration of emergency and executive draft is over at Powers. Under 1, emergency purchasing, and it says, I order that the village may enter into contracts for the emergency purchase of goods and services. And then also it says that our administrator can do the same. I guess my question would be to you all, it seems like when there are situations that arise where the staff needs board approval, we can get an email and respond to that like we just got the SALT approval today. I'm not sure that needs to be an executive privilege when you have a board that responds in a timely fashion. So I would just question that portion of it and say, is that part necessary?
Well, I think, you have to realize this could be something that happens late at night when people might have their phones off. It's not always conducive to business hours, and that's where an emergency purchase might be in order, and you cannot reach everybody via email.
I can jump in real quick, Jen. Real quick, I'll tell you, just through prior experience, having some things pop up. I remember one time we had a tornado come through the village I was working for, and it gives them the ability to hit the hardware store and buy tarps, buy emergency equipment that we might need in the middle of the night, things of that nature. It's nothing that is really out of the ordinary, other than, okay, we don't have a contract with Ace Hardware, but if they've got, access to 100 tarps and we need tarps, or we need bags of ice, or we need whatever, we can get it immediately without having to wait for a board to respond and go, well, yeah, that makes sense, go ahead and get it.
Right.
And to be clear, that's currently authorized within his powers as they're approved in the ordinance now. The question is whether the board wants that to allow that privilege to go longer than what is already currently allowed, which would be the next board meeting or the 7 days absent renewal. But as far as the scope of authority, that's not being changed. And if the board does want to change it in the future, it certainly could, but that would be an amendment to the ordinance rather than what this resolution is doing.
So I guess, can you just be clear on when it expires then?
So the way currently it would expire at the end of the emergency at either the state or the federal level, or if appropriate sooner, just to alleviate having to necessitate, coming before the board regularly. And that can be changed. That was just more of an evergreen clause, which is what many communities are doing, because they don't want their board to have to keep meeting, but that's up to the board as to how often it does or doesn't want to have to revisit the issue.
Okay, so we would be having our regular board meetings anyway. If we would have our regular board meetings as regularly scheduled, this would be just an item that we would either decide to renew or to stop at every board meeting that we would normally have. Is that correct? So it would go into the length of until our next board meeting, right?
Yeah, I think the thought is a lot of boards aren't sure that they are going to continue to meet, so they want to preempt the issue. But if you're, again, it's up to what the board believes. I mean, nobody really knows at this point what is probable. So that's the thought process behind it. But again, that's up to the board.
I think at this time, no one's going anywhere really. Most people are stuck at home. There's only 6 of us board members to get a hold of. We clearly can do it remotely. I don't know if this is warranted at this time. We can certainly address it at our next board meeting. If there comes a time where many of us fall ill and we can't have a board meeting, then we can address it at that time. But I think this is a little early to do an automatic renewal on this. I think this is something that is well within our capability of making a decision at our next board meeting if we want to renew it or not.
Laura,
and the one other caveat that I wanted to mention was, a part of the thought behind the entire declaration is because if there's funding that becomes available, that status would have to be active. So that's part of it too, is not having the emergency status lapse and then have funding to be available and have the board not having to maintain that state.
Laura,
it doesn't. Wouldn't it continue and then we decide to renew it, or does it automatically? Is there a deadline stop of it, or it's automatically consistent. There's no loss of emergency status if we renew it the next meeting, correct?
No.
If you renew it, correct.
Laura,
Right, so there wouldn't be a problem, so that would not be an issue if we decided to renew it.
Well, there's
Well, do
also
you-
the 7-day under the Disaster Act.
yeah, Laura, can you
There's
clarify?
two separate provisions.
I think there's some confusion. If the board does not approve this resolution, does the declaration last the shorter of 7 days or the next regular board meeting, or the longer of those?
So there's different, this is, the declaration is combining two different powers. There's the state of emergency and the emergency powers. The state of emergency itself requires 7 days renewals. The emergency powers go until the next board meeting.
So
Okay, so the state of
So in essence-
emergency, can you describe what then the two differences are, since they have two different deadlines then?
Can I ask a quick question real quick? I think, Laura, clarify this if I'm wrong or not, but one of the reasons why we do this is because you mentioned funding. If there's any kind of state or federal funding that's allotted to the village because of the declaration of disaster, doesn't it usually go back to the date that we vote on this? So we would get it as of today if we voted on it versus as of 2 weeks from now if we don't vote on it for 2 weeks?
Well, so the board, hypothetically, the board does not have to prove anything tonight. The president could make the declaration of emergency, and then, within 7 days from now, the board can decide whether or not the emergency still exists and vote to continue or not continue. There's some conflicts between the municipal code and the Emergency Services Act with regard to how long that time frame is. So to be prudent, it would be 7 days. One could argue that because the board adopted the ordinance adopting the municipal code, it would extend to the next board meeting, but that's not entirely clear. So the most conservative approach would be to say every 7 days.
So, but you were saying, does that cover both the declaration of emergency and the emergency regulation, or emergency executive order?
The orders would extend to the orders are concurrent with what the municipal code says, which is till the next board meeting.
Right, so we could say fine with the emergency declaration and have that renewed, but then we can decide to make a decision each time on the executive order, regulations and executive orders portion of that every board meeting, correct?
I think technically you could. In practice, it gets a little bit muddied because the purpose of having the declaration kind of runs aligned with the emergency powers, that you need your elected official or your village president to be able to act in a case of an emergency. So I think one would argue it's not really an emergency if you don't need that person to be able to do emergency things. Just from the very practical standpoint, how these two statutes work together. But I think technically, because of the differing time frames, you could do that.
Okay, so oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I would just say to clarify, Heidi, the way I understand it, sitting back listening, is that it's more important that we keep this in place and not have any lapse in it. So if that means that we approve this and it just runs until we deem as a board, I guess my question then would be, do we then say to Brent, hey, we feel like the emergency is up, can you get this on the next agenda so that, we stop the declaration?
Yeah, and I think if the board, I think that would be, having the board come together, you could approve it more or less indefinitely, while the state of emergency exists. But if that time comes and somebody believes that, okay, we don't need this anymore, any board member can call that emergency meeting and the board could act to rescind the declaration or the powers.
Okay.
Okay, we have a first and a second. Any other discussion? We'll go with it as written. Roll call, please, clerk.
Trustee Montalto?
Aye.
Trustee Heron?
Aye.
Trustee Cook?
Aye.
Trustee Lindy?
Aye.
Trustee Conan?
Aye.
Trustee Trustee Walter.
Aye.
Motion carries.
Okay. May I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Just to clarify, was that both items? I'm sorry.
Oh, I apologize. Let me do the, can I get a motion to approve the declaration of emergency and executive order? Thank you, Brent.
So
And,
moved.
I'm sorry, the order doesn't need
Oh.
the approval of the board. That's what the village president just makes that declaration.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, all right.
I
That's-
rescind my.
Okay, so you make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
May I get a second by trustee Montalto. All in favor of adjourning, state aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion adjourned. Thank you, everyone.